Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Talk HR UK podcast of 2021. For those of you that haven't tuned in before, I'm Simon Geere, and when I'm not talking to HR, development and reward professionals about helping them find new roles in the southeast of the UK and working with great HR leaders, I'm conducting this podcast. So I live the dream, basically. It's wonderful. Today, I am joined by David Shimkus. Hello, David.
Hi.
Hi. I've known David a long time. It's about 15 years now. David is a learning and development and organisational development professional and a subject matter expert. And we've been talking really over the last few months, really during lockdown in 2020, about an interesting subject to tackle in our planned conversation. And we came up with the concept of learning and development framework. So that's going to be the thrust of our discussion today. But before we dive into that, I guess I wanted to, obviously, David, give you the chance to introduce yourself and a brief bio of you and yours, really.
Yeah, great, Simon. Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I do like talking about learning development, so hopefully we're not going to overrun too much. Potted history of me. I started life as a debt collector, pretty good at that. So then I used to teach people to be debt collectors and to do that in, I guess, a very professional way. From there, moved to setting up contact centres, outsourced contact centres for a lot of the companies that you would have heard of, like Sky, O2, etc., and more in terms of the L&D frameworks or learning development, onboarding, recruitment, but then also, I guess, into quality management systems and employing those. Was head of L&D for a multinational PLC for a few years, and then went a little bit feral and went into operations and sales as operations manager, head of sales, and so on and so forth. And I guess for the last 8 years or so, I've been either running projects or running consultancy in terms of learning development, organizational development, operational alignment and efficiency programs. But my heart is very much within learning development space, leadership development, just getting the best out of organizations and people. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Fantastic, thank you. So diving straight in, I suppose, we mentioned L&D frameworks. I mean, in your mind, as an L&D professional, describe it, tell us what it is. What's a learning and development framework?
Yeah, and that's one of those expansive questions. An L&D framework for me is, in its simplest form, it's an aid memoir. It's a to-do list to hang your post-it notes on to remind yourself to do things. And I guess if you're thinking about, small organizations growing into larger organizations and the different pain points they go through, it sometimes is that post-it note of these are the things I need to do and this is how I need to frame that. And then as your organization becomes a bit more mature, or you realize that talent, because of the industry you're in, is perhaps a bigger key to your success than maybe some of the technology or a piece of capital equipment or something like that, then it's a requirement to, get a little bit more serious, a little bit more planned out, and start to have a framework in place that is still that to-do list, but it's going to take you well into the future. It's going to remind you to do the things that you need to do, but remind your departments or your strategic business units or whatever it then ends up as being, to remember to develop talent, to align that talent to your strategy rather than just do a bunch of training. And to, I guess, get the best out of people, I'd say. I suppose its purpose is to ensure that talent is developed, it is right, it is fit for purpose, and it is achieving what your strategy is hoping to achieve and to give you competitive edge. And I think that's probably the key word there. It's around ensuring it happens rather than hoping it happens. And more mature companies measure and improve that as they go along.
Interesting. So, I mean, you touched on it there initially. I mean, but some people's first reaction when they hear L&D framework is to think training plan, very pragmatic. What do you think, what does an L&D framework achieve that a training plan does not?
Okay. All right. So training plans are really important. They will say, this is what needs to happen. This is potentially when it needs to happen, or this is when I need to spend my money on the training courses or whatever it happens to be. And I suppose a training plan can be an individual thing. So somebody comes on board, they're doing their induction, and they have a training plan to get them up to expert or to the next role. But they tend to be quite specific to either an individual or maybe a department, and they tend to be quite linear. We go here and we go here, and potentially even just linked in with performance management and a KPI. I guess think of it like a calendar, basically. So a framework is where you are perhaps taking that training plan, but what you're doing is you're saying, okay, how do I achieve the business plan? How do I achieve the strategy? What talent do I need and when do I need them? And how do I get them on board? And how do they arrive at the right point at the right time, just when I need that? So it's a lot more sophisticated, but it's also thinking about other informal areas of learning and development and talent management and talent development. It's thinking about, how do I capture some of that and foster some of the informal learning that happens just by simply walking into office on day one? A member of staff is learning and soaking up stuff. They don't do the training plan. They just sit and watching, going, oh, okay, it's like this here. So that framework allows you to interrogate it, pre-plan for it, and actually predict some of the challenges that they're going to have in the future. And where I start to get a little bit stocky is really pulling apart an organization's business strategy, really getting into the details of that and understanding where they're looking for competitive edge in the future. Maybe they're using blue ocean strategy, or they're using some kind of strategic framework in which to grow their business and to be competitive. So how do you create the right people and the behaviors, and how can you put that into everything else that HR is trying to do, but everything else that the operations are trying to do, whether that's an immediate ad hoc piece of training because they've just decided to invent a product, or whether there is something a little bit more long term. So it's that, you know, that belts and braces completely aligned to the business. And I think that's the difference between a framework and perhaps a calendar training plan.
Thank you. Okay, that's a nice pragmatic explanation. So moving that on then, and this is where it gets quite interesting and technical, and you know, hopefully where I will learn a lot, and hopefully our listeners too. So how do you identify the right L&D framework for your situation, you know, for your organization?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess the starting point is not in training. Don't think learning development. Think about where your organization's journey is in how mature it is. And a lot of organizations, individuals probably watching this will maybe be familiar with maturity frameworks or maturity models. I know Gartner like doing them. They've pretty much been invented for everything. So you've got that classic 5 stages, which I've written down because I can never remember them. The initial stage, where an organization is a bit ad hoc, it was individualistic, a bit heroic, we kind of get there. Then there's a repeatable, you start to get some documentation in, and you start to have some defined outcomes. And then you're moving into more defined, where you have those planned outcomes. And as an organization, you're able to deliver on time every time. And then from that point, you've got the capability level, and then ultimately the efficient level, where it is you're able to continuously improve and continually get to the next stage. And you're almost like a self-managing organization that kind of sorts itself out and very predictive of the environment. So that's always my first question: where are you as an organization in your maturity? And what is your plan, and what is the roadmap to get you to that position? So if you're quite young as an organization, or maybe immature, and not many people like to call their organizations immature after maybe 20 years of running it, but if it's mostly maybe a smaller organization, you're kind of getting by because you can see everyone in the organization in your office in one space, then choosing the most simplest framework is probably the easiest thing to do. And then it's starting to build up from there. And probably the simplest framework is the 70-20-10 framework.
Now, this I was familiar with, so I was with you so far.
So that's sometimes called a framework. It's sometimes just called some guidelines. And quite frankly, it's kind of a bit of guidelines, a bit of both. It was originally developed by, I can't remember the name of the chap, but they interviewed a lot of successful executives and said, look, how did you get here? What was the most important part of your journey going up? And they broadly said that 70% of what they learned was on the job, getting stuck in, doing it, but kind of ad hoc. And sort of being, I guess, that sink and swim, not very structured, but shadowing and noticing what's going on around. 20% was then when it was becoming a little bit more informal training, but learning from others, maybe coaching, maybe mentoring, networking, maybe having some collaboration on a particular project or product or something like that. And then the final 10% is that formal, classic, classroom structured piece of training with your pre, your during, your post work. Hopefully there's post work, or maybe even going to a webinar or a conference where you sat there and you're at a seminar and you're just soaking that stuff in. It's that fine moment. So if you think of that as the simplest form of framework, and then you start to really ponder, okay, what does that mean? It means as an organization, if I can start to plan that on-the-job training and I can start to measure that on-the-job training, what would be the ideal outcome on each of those parts of that on-the-job training? And how can I engineer it so I get a better outcome? And then you're starting to use a 70-20-10 as something that you can interrogate, you can massage, you can move, you can improve, you can change around, you can start to be flexible with. Similarly, with that 20%, how do I get the people to mentor in a more appropriate way? How can I measure the mentors? How can I develop them? And then that becomes part of this sort of organic growing structure of learning development. And I guess the final part of that is once I've created those touch points, a project plan, effectively, if that's what you would call it, or the dependencies of all that on a mind map, you can then start to say, okay, how can I test and measure this? How can I record this? And as soon as you start doing that, then the guys at ISO who come and audit you start to go, oh my God, you're amazing. You can actually track the fact that you've defined some piece of competency, skills, behavior. You defined what's required to deliver the end product. You've put some structure around that, and then you've measured that to get some continuous improvement, and then you put that back in the loop. And you start to fly through these ISO audits. Certainly went through one with, I think it was BSI quite a few years ago, and they would just go, oh, okay, great, fine. Most times they see a training plan, but no one's measured it and no one actually knows if it's any good anymore.
Yeah, how effective is it? Yeah.
So I guess that's the kind of simplest form. And actually, it's a really good structure, but it is effectively an memoir, and you can become more complicated the more you get going. I guess most HR professionals would understand that and get that, and it's how then do you get on board the operations to understanding it and getting it and seeing the value of it. So yeah, that's definitely the simplest form.
Okay. So 70-20-10, as you say, a lot of people will have heard of that. I see it a lot when I see job descriptions for people that are hiring L&D professionals. That's always quite high up, experience of delivering a 70-20-10 framework, etc.
Yeah.
But you mentioned in our preliminary, last year, a couple of different, not necessarily more sophisticated, but maybe more complicated versions that you've seen businesses adopt and help them adopt. Tell us a little more about those.
Okay, so the one I guess I've had the most success with is the Academies framework, which is McKinsey, but it's based on the book Elevating Learning Development. And it talks about 70-20-10 because it's still a very viable model. Oh, there's one thing I forgot to say about 70-20-10. It doesn't have to be 70-20-10.
Okay, you can move the levers.
Yeah, because every industry will be slightly different, will have a slightly different demand. If you get hung up on that 70-20-10, you kind of miss the point. It's to align to your product and service. But, you know, that's why I say it's a guideline. So the Academy's framework uses it and uses it as, again, this, look, you know, this is how people are successful, so why we shouldn't ignore it. But it puts it into a framework from journey, right from conception through to being able to make it part of the muscle and understand it. Probably the simplest thing, if I show you a little visual of it, because there's a lot of stages and we'll forget what the first one is by the time we come around to the last one, and then I'll just talk through that. Is that okay? Okay. So.
Perfect.
The framework here is, first part is you've got to align with the business strategy. And that's why I've had the most success with it, because often when you start to talk about training plans or learning development, it's almost like an audit requirement and it doesn't really fit the business. So the first part of this is sitting down with the business, sitting down with the strategy makers, also sitting down with people who really understand the pain points of it, and then you start to build and understand what's required out of the learning development that's required. So what is the scope? How can you rely on it? What's the talent that's required? In 5 years, what do you need to happen? Okay. The next part, and it obviously comes straight after relying with business, the business units and HR co-own the academy. So it's really important that within this framework, you have senior leaders within the operations part of the business, whether that's sales, whether that's manufacturing, whether that's coding within your R&D team. They need to have buy-in, but also accountability of part of the budget area. So really a business partner, that classic business partner status that you have, but where you're co-owning that with those individuals, and those individuals are able to say, these are the pain points I have, or this is my roadmap for the future for my department, and I need to make sure these individuals are developed. Otherwise, you have as you may have seen past, you have a training plan, but no one's ever allowed to go on the training, or they're sort of allowed to do it, but kind of in their own time.
Sure.
And the actions that they do after the training have got nothing to do with the training, so then they forget it.
Yeah,
so that
exactly.
real co-ownership, and that needs to be written into the framework. Then this next bit, and this is where I guess L&D managers and L&D professionals really earn their badges and do a lot of the heavy lifting. You assess capability gaps and then estimate the value. So this is where your L&D individual, in line with the business, because it has to be done together, you'll start to develop a really good comprehensive skills matrix, capability matrix, whether it's skills, knowledge, behaviors, all linked to the business plan, the strategy, or the purpose. And then you start to identify gaps through potential performance management or measurement. And then you identify the value of filling those gaps to the business, and they then become part of the KPIs to measure the success of the training, but also make sure that the business is benefiting from the learning development.
Okay.
Then you start to design learning journeys. And the learner journey is more than, I think I mentioned it, you go on a training course and then you're not given any opportunity, or you don't give yourself any opportunity to go and actually practice it and get good at it. So a learner journey is from what happens pre the piece of learning that's required, what happens during, and what happens post that piece of learning to make sure it then becomes part of the muscle and that there's some kind of continuous improvement. I suppose this is where you have multiple training plans potentially going through. And also the learner journeys there, which could be departmental, they could be also organisational wide. You might have a learner journey there for organisational wide. And perhaps if your organisation is rolling out a new piece of software, maybe it's suddenly decided it needs to remote house everyone and everyone's going to be on Teams.
Can you imagine?
Who knows? It could happen. So the learner journey needs to be designed to be able to do that, but cope and get any snagging and lessons learned from that. From there, execute, measure, and then scale. So that's one thing. You can do test campaigns in the department from your new area, which is why I think it's quite good, because you base it on the department, then you grow it from there. So you can learn from mistakes, and then you scale and you keep scaling. Measure impact. And there are, I guess there's the three types of measurement that I would typically use. One of them is the business excellence. So how does the training, the learning, development improve business KPIs?
Right.
Will be one of my measurements.
Direct measures onto business effectiveness.
Measures on that. And actually, some of those KPIs get invented during assess capability and estimate value. Because suddenly you're talking to operational people and they go, actually, that would be really valuable. Let's measure that.
Okay.
Second KPI I'd look at would be learning excellence. So how has the learning changed behaviors? Not just hitting KPIs, but how we change behaviors, how we change competency, confidence, the ability to have more resilient talent within us. The third one is then that operational excellence. And I would be looking to measure how well you're using your L&D resources, how well you're using the budget, the learning management system collateral that you have, any training providers that you come, how are you maximizing that as a business? Yeah. So then you start to institutionalize because you've got great data. It then becomes to integrate into a norm. It becomes part of the muscle. And then you're back into that enabling 70-20-10 we're talking about. And effectively, you just continue going through that. If your business has a cycle of a year, then that's how it would do. Or if your business is releasing a new product, well, actually, you could base this product release.
Understand.
Release. I think that's one of the ones I kind of drop onto most. It gives me a really good to-do list for myself as an L&D professional, but also then for the organisation. So yeah, that tends to be my go-to. It tends to get the buy-in the quickest, definitely. There is another one. It's a beast.
Well, it needs, with that introduction, we clearly need to know more.
I am not going to go through each of these areas, but I just want to show you how intelligent this stuff can be and how broad it can be. And if you really are in that great maturity, so your level 4, level 5 on your maturity as an organization, is kind of where you want to be going to, because it means that every individual, but also every part of that talent management, whether that's to do with the HR, whether that's to do with the onboarding, recruitment, whether that's also to do the operational areas, every single fiber is also aligned around making sure your talent are as enabled as they possibly can be to be as successful as they possibly can be. So I want to show you this one. It is a beast. I do really like it. So this
is the aspirational, successful, large, developed business, looking for the most sophisticated model.
And there it is. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty darn sophisticated. But there's a lot of stuff in here. But look, first of all, you've got the organizational governance and management, and you're talking about your strategy on that one side. And then you've got your learning architecture. And I spend a lot of time with people designing learning architecture. What do you need on this part of learning architecture or skills architecture or talent architecture, whatever you want to call it, to then directly align with the outcomes of the business. So you've got those two kind of bookends holding this thing together. Okay. And you've got your different learning programs, which you can set up and have different individuals running. So you might have, so certainly at Dell, they'll have potentially different departments with 50, 60 more staff in each of those areas running these programs, testing and measuring these programs. You've got your audience environments, you've got your approaches, formal, on-demand, social, embedded. And this is, I guess, harking back to that 70-20-10 and reminding us that talent development, learning development happens at all points within that part of that compass. You've got the disciplines. And this is really interesting. This is something that that you then need to spend a long time on as a learning development department is, do I have the disciplines within my staff, within my team, within L&D, to be able to deliver these things? Sure. One of I think the major skills which I find is most lacking is information architecture, and certainly that data analytics, that measurement part, that intelligence around that, so that you can become predictive with whatever you're trying to do, rather than, oh gosh, right, okay, quickly, we've got to get this in because it already went live 2 weeks ago and we've got lots of mistakes happening. Been there. Then you've got your tools and you've got the LMS elements in there as well, but your assessments, your models, reporting and analysis, etc. And then that culture, how do you set that culture in there? So I really like this framework, and it takes a quite mature L&D department to be able to deliver it well, but also it takes quite a mature organization to be able to deliver it well. And I would say, yeah, it's aspirational, but coming back to that 70-20-10, it's not always necessary. You don't have to go as large as this. It's not necessary, depending on the simplicity of your business.
Okay.
So that's
interesting. So that final one was the Bursin model, and it feeds nicely into my next question. Actually, you mentioned the culture piece there. So with any of these frameworks, they're going to be something new to an organization, and the business leaders there in many cases. How do you embed that framework to make it to become culturally normal, I suppose?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess if you're looking at that Burton one, I think it needs, you've already probably got L&D reasonably well established in there, or HR is reasonably well established in there for that to start to work. Mm-hmm. I think if you can start to deploy that initially, and you've got nothing there, you can still be successful. It's just going to take a long time, and that's okay. It's a journey, but as long as you've got something that you're working on there, I think it's that. Well, the L&D manager's got all the idea, but the organisation has no gear. If that makes all that kind of understanding there. So I'd say to start to embed these things, I always go to the operations. I always go to the business and go, what's bugging you? What is the problem here? Why do these people leave? What frustrates you about these things? And then you start to get them opening up about, wouldn't it be nice to, and it would be great if you could take some of this away from me. And then you start to collaborate. Well, I'm not going to take anything away from you. It's still yours. But what I'll do is I'll support you. And how about we also do this? So I think it's helping the senior operational leadership and actually some of the frontline operational leadership understand that it is an enhancement and it will make their lives easier. Because to embed it, you need to have the time and the resources. People need to feel as though they can, that what they're about to do is, in terms of learning and development, whether it's mentoring, coaching, reading a book, or maybe creating their own L&D content for the rest of their department, that is actually good time to be spent. You shouldn't be feeling guilty about reading a book if that book enhances you with what you're doing at work. So what the big thing is try to find ways of attaching it to the business and how it runs. And then as the business starts to buy into the benefit that you have, you can then start to shape that a little bit more, become a bit more predictive, become a little bit more future orientated. I suppose the other thing I do when trying to embed, it's actually what I'm doing at the moment, is I'm helping the business to understand the personal specifications needed for their staff. And sometimes some of the grunt work is that job description looks like it's from the 70s. Shall we just, remove facts from there and start to get something else in there? By polishing those in, you can then support performance management systems, you can support appraisals, you can support all these things, but also you can support a really good quality gap analysis between what the personal specification should be and that individual there, and then you can start helping. So that's how I'd start to embed those at that cultural level. I guess the final thing is in terms of that embedding, and I don't know whether you're a fan of Seth Godin's DIP or what's the other one, the change dynamic curve, the grieving curve. But as soon as you start to deliver any of these, you're going to get, this is great. And then you're going to get,
hit the wall. Yeah,
people hit the wall. So it's how when you're project planning these in, you can engineer in the quick wins. You can engineer in the extra bit of resource because you know people are going to hit the wall. And then that's the thing that turns an L&D framework. And that's the thing that turns an organization out, how you transition it through cultural or operational change.
Interesting. Okay. So obviously these are big things to get into that culture. And you've done a number of times, in your previous life as well as now, really. So what tips do you have for winning over a business? You need to influence those leaders, in terms of the design of it, the implementation itself, keeping business, making it become business as usual and keeping BAU going during the change.
Yeah. Okay. So it depends on the individual. Okay, it depends on the individual. What a rubbish way to answer that.
Very, very politician-esque. Yeah.
I know, whatever. So if I'm talking to, let's go classic. If I'm talking to the sales manager, she or he is going to be potentially very KPI focused on very particular outcomes and will have points at various points in the week, month, quarter, year, depending on the organization, and will typically be too busy. Typically. So my approach partly needs to be, I guess, humanitarian. I need to, okay, understand this is the way that this individual works. How can I provide them with some of those nice wins quickly, efficiently, that make them say, oh, that worked, I saw a spike, oh, that worked. So it's very quick interactions in there to say that worked, I have a spike. Also, those individuals tend to like people taking stuff away from them so they can get on with other things. So that kind of person-to-person bit of humanity in there, that's really important. Other thing in terms of influencing, especially senior individuals, I'd say everyone in some form or another gets their backside kicked for some reason, whether it's to do, and it could be in a very pleasant way, but everyone's got some targets or some objectives that either they or the business needs them to achieve. And it's always around talking in their language. It's always going, right, okay, so we need to design something that increases this by 2-3% and that. We need to find something. So it's always talking about that, and then it's designing something that delivers that, which is exactly what an L&D framework should be rather than a training plan. It's something that aligns directly to a business. And then you start talking their language, which is why I like the Academy's framework, because you are measuring 3 points of KPI, the business excellence, the learning excellence, and the operational excellence. And then you're able to create a really nice story with that.
So finally then, David, what happens? What are the risks of not having this in place? It's a bit of a leading question because I'm sure HR professionals watching this will have experienced it firsthand. But it's always good to touch on what goes wrong when there isn't a learning and development framework established.
Okay. Let's go big picture first of all. I don't know. In fact, I don't know if this is the case now, because unfortunately we're in a situation where there's probably more talent in the talent pool available to us, but there aren't so many jobs that there were maybe was a year ago. So perhaps things are changing in terms of that. But as you start to recruit and as you start to want to retain talent, or employee value proposition, which will be very familiar to a lot of HR professionals, your EVP. What is your EVP? And do you have one? Well, you do, but it might not be very good. You might not be measuring it. Having some kind of framework in place to say, we will make you successful because we have all the elements in place to get you to the success that you want to have. Because presumably you're joining to be successful, whatever you measure that against. We will have the support structure in place to enable for you to feel part of this business. So you feel as though you belong here, this is a great place to be, you are having your needs met, but also you're able to be successful. Building that into EVP, well, an L&D framework gives you the ability to attain some of that, especially if you think about some of the the younger individuals that are within the job market at the moment, they expect to be treated impeccably. And if you think about, leading different cultures, leading different generations, the way you lead a baby boomer and what they're looking for it is potentially different to where you're leading a Gen X, Gen Y, Millennial, Gen X. It's going to be slightly different. And L&D framework is going to provide you with some forethought of that. So not having that all becomes a little bit ad hoc. You get people and they go on that curve and they go, oh, it's not as good. I'm waiting for longer than I needed to get this. I'm frustrated because I don't have the training just in time for me to have it. I'm going to be not very good at my job for the next month. Well, that's fun. I tell you what, I'll look over there because there's a better job over there. So ultimately, it's about that talent retainment. It's about those kind of things. Also, because it is about strategy, it is about organizational effectiveness. If you don't have a really good quality framework in place that always reminds you to have whatever learning is required and measure it and improve it, then how do you know your product's going to be any good? You might see on your spreadsheet it looks very good, but your customers aren't quite getting what your spreadsheet says. Your customers aren't quite getting that. And that's when you start to lose custom, you start to lose those elements in there. That loyalty is when your customers expect one thing from your brand, but you're not developing your staff to be able to want to deliver it or enable to deliver it. But I'd say they're pretty much, they're the big ones. There's a whole bunch of stuff about, not being able to copy and paste or not being able to code properly or just getting something wrong in there. But really, it comes down to organizational competitiveness.
Oh, definitely. Really interesting. Hey, look, David, thank you so much for your time, because I know, I know you're a busy guy and it's taken a while to get this lined up, but I'm sure our listeners and watchers will enjoy hearing about the concept of L&D frameworks, the 70-20-10 model, the McKinsey Academies piece, and that last, the beast. This was that's it. Yeah. The Bursing and Associates piece. So, and some tips as to how we can further develop these within our organization. So
absolutely. You're very welcome. It's always fun to talk about this stuff.
So that really comes across. You're a great orator. So, but hey, look, enjoy the rest of the week. Happy New Year, as they say. And I wish you all the best for 2021. It's got to get better, hasn't it? It's the only way is up.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
You and me both. Hey, look, thanks again, David. All the best.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye.